Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to IPI, the International Peace Institute. I'm Sarah Taylor. I lead IPI's work on women, peace, and security. We are here today, of course, for today's panel discussion on lessons in mediation from South Sudan's troubled peace process. Today's discussion is indeed part of IPI's ongoing work on mediation. I'm delighted to be moderating today's discussion, not least because it follows so perfectly from an event that we had last week with African women mediators. Expecting a lot of the same themes to be coming up in today's discussion about South Sudan. But before we start what I'm sure will be a robust and interesting panel discussion, we will hear opening remarks from Ambassador Joni Laaksonen, the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Permanent Mission of Finland to the United Nations. Finland has been supporting IPI's research and convening on mediation, a welcome and not unsurprising role, given Finland's engagement and commitment to mediation globally, a commitment that, of course, includes strong support for women in mediation processes. So without further ado, Ambassador, it is my pleasure to give you the floor for the opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and good afternoon to everybody. I wish to start by thanking our colleagues here at the International Peace Institute for the very fruitful cooperation with the government of Finland over the years. Finland is happy to continue supporting IPI's work on the highly useful Lessons from Mediation project. This event is yet another example of IPI's thoughtful and thorough study of different aspects related to peace mediation. As many of you know, promoting mediation is one of Finland's foreign policy priorities. We have worked actively to promote mediation in international organizations by co-chairing the Friends of Mediation. We have aimed at strengthening the role of mediation in the peaceful conflict resolution. In South Sudan, Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland has supported CMI's work of strengthening the role of South Sudan's political institutions in conflict resolution. Finland has also deployed police officers to the UNMISS operation, including a specialized police team on sexual and gender-based violence. Today's topic on lessons in mediation from South Sudan's troubled peace process is very timely. Just last Friday, the SRSG and the head of the UN mission in the country, David Sherry, reported of intense fighting as well as incidents of killing, sexual violence, and looting. The mission has placed its peacekeepers on high alert to protect IDPs. SISG Scherer reminded us of the upcoming peace talks at the High-Level Revitalization Forum and of the need for all parties to stop fighting. Just recently, ASG for peacekeeping operations, Bintu Keita, visited South Sudan, and her main message to the parties was still the same. There is no military solution to the conflict. The civil war broke out in South Sudan in 2013. That was over 4 years ago. After various mediation attempts and even a comprehensive peace deal in 2015, we have not come too far. It's important to reflect on the mediation efforts in South Sudan. As the ACAD is attempting to revitalize the peace process, this IPI report launched today could not have been timelier. This report provides a valuable analysis from a particular angle, and the US Special Envoy Booth's team on the ICAD mediation led by former Ethiopian Foreign Minister Seyum Mesin. As US is the penholder for South Sudan in the Security Council, the angle is highly interesting for observers of the South Sudan peace process. The analysis reflects the principles outlined in the UN Guidance for Effective Mediation and thereby provides empiric feedback to our joint aspirations. We look forward to hearing later reflections from different angles. Let us also highlight an important theme for Finland. The report describes the attempts to make the negotiation process more inclusive. These and other lessons learned are of utmost importance in the future attempts to resolve the conflict in South Sudan, but also in other contexts, since similar challenges are faced in all mediation processes. The prospects for durable peace, sustainable development, and prosperous societies are better if we all pay attention to inclusion of the whole society. The inclusive approach to peace building is necessary for the achievement of permanent results, and sustaining peace requires involvement of all actors from different parts of society. This means youth, women, and civil society. Finland supports the efforts aiming at strengthening the African Union's mediation capacity, also explore the ways to collaborate concretely with FemWise network to promote the role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts. Civil society actors and women's organizations in particular must be given a stronger role in peace negotiations. Women's organizations can highlight the root causes of conflicts and help to make early warning mechanisms more effective during the implementation of peace agreements. So thank you very much, and I look forward to today's discussions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those framing comments. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you as well for highlighting the important issues of inclusivity and some of the efforts around increasing the engagement of women in mediation processes. So it's time for the substantive part of our discussion. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce what I think will be a really interesting discussion with our panelists here today. So I will start with introductions, and then we'll move on to the actual substance of the discussion. We will, of course, preserve time at the end for questions and answers. So to my right, Zach Virton, an American writer, foreign policy analyst, and former diplomat who's worked on a wide range of conflict zones, political transitions, and peace processes. He's spent the last 12 years working in international politics and peace and conflict issues. His background includes serving in the Obama administration as Director of Policy for the U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan and South Sudan, 6 years at International Crisis Group, and a role as advisor on peace operations and in multilateral affairs in the UN Security Council. In addition to consulting for numerous organizations, including IPI, he was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and is a term member at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's currently a visiting lecturer of public and international affairs at Princeton University. And today, of course, we are particularly interested in hearing from him about his new report. Then to my left, we have Dr. Jacques Madut-Jacques, specializes in conflict and security and on political violence as a public health crisis. He is currently the director of the Sud Institute and a researcher at the Center for Global Health at State University of New York. He is the author of several books, including Breaking Sudan, The Search for Peace, and Sudan, Race, Religion, and Violence. Dr. Jacques holds a PhD in medical anthropology from the University of California in Los Angeles, and we're particularly interested in hearing from him today about his perspectives of what's going on in South Sudan relating to that work. And then our third panelist will be Dr. Francois Marino, who has been the DPKO team leader for South Sudan since August of 2011. A former Africa program director for Crisis Group. He rejoined the United Nations in 2010 to support the last year of the implementation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement that led to the independence of South Sudan. Based in Khartoum, he was part of the UN team that supported the African Union high-level implementation panel's facilitation of post-independence agreements between Sudan and South Sudan, and from headquarters, contributed to establish and support the activities of the Office of the UN Special Envoy for Sudan and South Sudan. Since 2014, he has been coordinating UN headquarters support to the UN team, assisting the IGAD-led process that delivered the agreement on the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan. And we're really looking forward to hearing from him today the latest updates on the political situation and reflections on the future of peace efforts in the country and region. So with that introduction, I'm glad to turn to Zach for his opening comments and more in his report.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to IPI for the mediation series, which, if you aren't familiar with it, is, how's that, better? is a great series, and a special thanks to Jake Sherman and to Delphine and to the whole team here at IPI, as well as to the fellow speakers here who both I've been fortunate to know for many years. Part of the reason I decided to do this paper was in part because the South Sudan peace process, and what I'm talking about today is the period from 2013 to 2015, because that peace process was so closed. And despite attempts to open the process, to make it more accessible, very few folks that were following either in the region or from New York or from Washington or other capitals could get a really firm grasp of what was actually happening there in Addis Ababa. Thus, the aim of this report is to offer a window into it. You'll see the paper is first and foremost a case study in mediation. It's not an in-depth examination of South Sudan's war or a chronological account of the process. It is an assessment of the mediation effort by IGAD with the help of a wider group of international peace supporters viewed through a lens of mediation best practice. My hope and our hope is that it offers some comparative value as we all think about future peacemaking efforts both in the region and further afield. First, I'll introduce the structure of the process in the mediation context, drawing, as the ambassador mentioned, on the UN Guide for Effective Mediation. Second, I'll mention some of the second-order dynamics that really influenced the negotiations and shaped its outcome. Third, I'll touch on the roles played by the immediate regional actors and a wider set of supporters, as that's a critical theme in this study, including, given our community here, the roles of the UN and UNMISS, the peacekeeping mission. Lastly, I'll briefly introduce some of the larger dilemmas confronted in this peace process, which I think are worthy of conversation, as this community will surely face them again, as mentioned elsewhere in the world. So just quickly to set the scene, the conflict in South Sudan began in late 2013, and after intensive shuttle diplomacy among regional actors and some in the wider international community, arms were twisted and peace talks were convened in neighboring Ethiopia that in just over a few weeks' time. Phase one of that process began in January 2014. The objective, to secure a ceasefire. Conflict was then fast and fluid in South Sudan, and the mediators believed that only once the fighting came under some degree of control would there be space to discuss the wider root causes of conflict. The ceasefire was signed fairly quickly, in just about 3 weeks' time, and though it nominally provided a basis to then move to a broader set of comprehensive talks, it was repeatedly broken in the weeks and months that followed. Phase two of the process attempted to expand the format and the scope of mediation. It began in February 2014 and lasted until August of 2015. It was a broader negotiation. Its objective was a political settlement and a range of reforms, but as we see very quickly, and this is detailed in the paper, it hit a roadblock early on, in part because of different narratives of the conflict and different ideas about what was needed in South Sudan and thus what was needed out of a mediation process. That takes us next to the mediation context. We know that most peace processes are complex, messy, very often nonlinear affairs, and as such, few efforts meet the aspirational principles that are outlined in the UN Guide for Mediation, which is designed to sort of inform the design and management of peace processes. Though in reality, we know that mediators very often face circumstances that are not ideal. They must make difficult trade-offs, and sometimes they have to break these rules to advance the objectives of a process. That said, nonetheless, I think the mediation fundamentals that are outlined therein offer a useful benchmark in framing any third-party mediation effort, hence I chose to use it here. I chose 6 of the principles from the UN Guide: mandate, architecture, and coherence of efforts, 1. 2, consent to a mediation. 3, impartiality. 4, inclusivity of a process. 5, the strategy and sequencing of a mediation team. And 6, the preparedness of the mediators and their support team themselves. The paper, as you'll see, illustrates critical deficits in 5 of the 6 areas. I'll mention a few of them now rather than going through all of them. First, on the mandate and the architecture, though it becomes a fundamental problem later in the process, this was one area that came together fairly well from the outset. IGAD member states, and when I mention that, I'm talking mostly about Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda as the sort of leaders in this regard, asserted a clear lead, and given their own historic roles in South Sudan's war and securing its independence, their knowledge of the parties, and their interest in stability on their own borders, there was a broad consensus that they had a comparative advantage. Senior representatives, both from the UN, from the US, from other key players outside of the region, signaled their clear support for an IGAD lead. The African Union and the UN Security Council followed suit. By contrast, the second principle is consent. There was almost none from the warring parties. And this will be a theme as we go today, and it is throughout the paper. This was particularly true for the government, which wanted to settle the conflict on the battlefield, and to the extent it engaged the process, it sought only to negotiate with the so-called rebels or the opposition movement, and it sought only to negotiate a ceasefire. It otherwise, for many months, sought to project a narrative of business as usual. The opposition, too, sought a military end on the battlefield, and though in time its leadership would have more to gain from a negotiated settlement, and consent would thus be forthcoming, though this only really happened after their attempt to seize control on the ground failed. Third principle from the UN guy, inclusivity. We all know that the politics of participation are often heated. Who gets a seat at the table and who not ate up an extraordinary amount of time, resources, effort at the beginning of phase 2 of the process. And despite a sustained push for an inclusive, multi-stakeholder process, the mediators faced an uphill battle in this regard, not least because the two main warring combatants were fundamentally opposed, but also because they didn't have sufficient enough backing from their mandating institution, IGAD, and its leadership. As a result, the process ultimately narrowed to an elite accommodation, something many believed at the time could not yield a sustainable outcome for South Sudan. Third, as I mentioned, are the additional dynamics. There are 6 or 7 in the paper, as I mentioned, sort of second-order dynamic that shaped the process and its outcome. First, I've alluded to the government's reluctance to negotiate, which was buoyed in part by external backing from Uganda, its neighbor to the south. Second was a fractious opposition. The so-called rebellion was an impromptu arrangement. It sort of materialized on the fly. And though there was a common desire for revenge among that group, the cleavages among the many anti-government elements revealed themselves when it came to longer-term objectives in the peace process. Third was forum shopping. It's a term well known in this community. In the spring of 2014, the so-called Arusha process materialized, which aimed to achieve peace instead by ruling South Sudan's ruling party, by reconciling South Sudan's ruling party, the SPLM. In my own estimation, that ultimately proved ill-conceived, both in substance and in process, in part because it broke a fundamental rule of mediation, forum shopping. If one or more parties did not like what they got in one forum, IGAD, they simply tried their lot at another forum, Arusha. And moreover, they attempted to play one off against each other, and that's exactly what happened. Fourth is summit diplomacy. The mediators I mentioned were not sufficiently empowered by their own bosses, and so when the process stalled, which was often, it would often require the heads of state from the entire region to convene. This ate up huge amounts of time and resources and slowed the process at critical moments. Now, this sustained commitment from high-level actors was important in a theoretical sense, but at the same time, it effectively undercut the mediators in the eyes of the parties. Fifth is empty threats, and this is really a conversation about leverage. Here's where we saw some complicated dynamics between the region and the wider group of peace process supporters. On 5 separate occasions, IGAD threatened in writing and other means punitive measures against the parties, including sanctions and on occasion even direct military intervention. And 5 times, nothing followed. That rhetoric did not represent credible threats, and the parties knew that very early on. Moreover, it was particularly difficult then to pursue action either at the African Union or in the UN Security Council to bring leverage to bear there if IGAD didn't move first. Next is regional competition. The participation of immediate neighbors in any kind of conflict resolution, as we know from many examples around the world, is a double-edged sword, and their comparative advantages should be weighed against the risk of partisan interventions that may complicate matters. You can see where I'm going here. And so we ask ourselves, is proximity to the parties an advantage, or would a disinterested outsider with no history or direct ties to the region make a better mediator? It's a tough question, case-specific. In time, though IGAD asserted a lead, established a process, and made clear its intention to bring an end to the conflict, and they had the comparative advantage as mentioned, Over time, the values brought by these IGAD frontline states were outweighed by their competing national interests, internal rivalries, and their own stakes in the outcome. We can talk about this more in question and answer. I'll very rapid fire go through some of the key players. First, Kenya, given its own historic role in Sudan's peace agreement, the comprehensive peace agreement 7 or 8 years earlier, they were unhappy that the mediation ended up in neighboring Ethiopia. They sometimes worked very well at various levels, including high levels, with their Ethiopian counterparts, but other times they sought to pursue unilateral efforts, and there was some real friction between those two parties, sometimes embodied in the work of the mediators themselves. Second is Uganda, and as made clear in the paper, the role of Uganda was second to none among the regional actors. Its military intervention just after the conflict began on behalf of the government turned the tide on the battlefield and gave, in many ways, the South Sudan government a reason not to negotiate. It also, over time, fueled opposition contempt, as you might imagine. Sudan, to the north, stirred the pot by supplying arms to the opposition, and was particularly complicated given its own historic tensions with Uganda, which was then backing the government, as mentioned. And lastly was Ethiopia, though really shouldered the greatest burden in the process and in some ways played the most constructive role, ultimately became deeply frustrated over regional divisions and became concerned with its own perceptions of its own prestige as chair of IGAD. It took great pains to sort of maintain a veneer of IGAD unity despite the underlying rivalries I've mentioned and the divisions among IGAD states over the outcome in South Sudan. A range of other peace process supporters formed a sort of informal support network around the mediation. This was never codified anywhere. It happened in practice. They initially undertook shuttle diplomacy and coordinated messaging with the mediators and worked quite well for a number of months. And over time, a gap widened between those two groups, and we can talk more about why. Later in the process in 2015, when it was clear that regional divisions had poisoned, in a sense, the process, a number of the peace process supporters, our own team, the United States, and a few others encouraged the IGAD leadership to expand the mediation format, bring in a number of other African states who had expressed interest, bring in a wider set of peace process supporters. What were the goals? They were both structural and political. In theory, a wider format could hopefully mitigate the internal divisions that were sort of holding hostage the process. And secondly, the mediation team was in serious need of capacity, and that's outlined in the paper as well. And there was a hope that somehow by fusing those efforts, there could be a better division of labor. In practice, however, while it might have been a good idea, it didn't work in practice. The United States and the UN are the other two players I'll mention. Despite its huge historic role in South Sudan, the US was both inclined to back a regional process and also reluctant to own the process. A small team, of which I was a part of, provided strategic and technical advice to the mediators, though on a voluntary basis, and I can't say enough that its influence shouldn't be overstated. The IGAD mediation was in the lead. There are some parallels often made with the CPA process, which was entirely different. While Washington occasionally sought to play a greater role, including by bringing President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry to sort of breathe life into the process at various stages, it also missed important opportunities. Chief among them, and we could talk more about this, I think, are an opportunity early on to impose an arms embargo, which was hotly debated right across the street here. And second, in my opinion, an opportunity to bring leverage to bear on Uganda. And there was some of that was done, but in my estimation, not enough. Lastly, the UN Special Envoy was likewise an important and informal advisor to the mediation team. He too undertook shuttle diplomacy at the time. There was no direct political role for UNMISS itself. Why? First, its relationship with the government had become more complicated, but more importantly, in some sense, it was busy hosting more than 200,000 internally displaced persons on its own bases in country. One more level of detail, sort of UNMISS leaders in Juba were understandably frustrated that they didn't have a more direct link to the process, as decisions being made in Addis Ababa would inevitably impact the mission's mandate, posture, resources, etc. We did ultimately manage to bring a team of UNMISS advisors when it moved to implementation, though it was very late in the game. Conclude, and I'll leave most of the conclusions for later. As I note in the paper, in analyzing the mediation effort, singular conclusions are very hard to draw. Some believe the process was the best available, that it provided a framework for a viable peace, but it lacked the political will from the parties, and it lacked strong enough oversight mechanisms to make it stick. And I've mentioned the regional divisions, which complicated things. Others believe at the other end of the spectrum that it was a fundamentally flawed process from the outset. I think we'll get more to that, but I'll mention here two core challenges that were faced and I think underwrite much of this. First, there was no real consensus on the nature of the problem, and thus on the nature and scope of the solution. Second, I've alluded to this as well, but I think it bears reiteration. The success, I think, of any mediation effort depends first and foremost on the political will of the parties themselves. And South Sudan's warring combatants not only lacked the will to make peace, they were often, a number of them, very hostile to the very idea of a negotiated settlement. And as such, IGAD and its supporting cast faced a political and moral dilemma often confronted by outside actors when a conflict is, quote, not ripe for settlement, when trade-offs are made between ideal solutions and the really urgent imperative to stop the violence. We aren't going to stand around while tens of thousands of innocent civilians are slaughtered, but it bears the question, how do outside actors compel a mediated resolution of a conflict between two parties bent on war? Unfair to end it in a question, I suppose, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Zach, but it is the key question that we're attempting to grapple with, or one of the key questions we're attempting to grapple with. So I will now turn to Jack for your insights.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to IPI for inviting me again to South Sudan discussion. It's it has to really be said that a lot of efforts in New York to keep South Sudan being discussed and on the radar is definitely something to be commended in an environment where people are getting quite frustrated and fatigued by the situation in South Sudan. So thanks to IPI for keeping South Sudan on the radar of many people in New York City. I will just make a list of observations. Some of this will emphasize what Zach has said, and some will disagree in hope that all of it will make sense towards the end. So in Zach's paper, I was looking for a clear idea about mediation as a theory and as a practice that then you discuss whether mediation as has been practiced everywhere else in the world is the most suitable way to approach the crisis in South Sudan or not. I say this because there is definitely no two wars on the African continent are the same, such that a good mediation practice established in one place cannot really be applied successfully in all the others. So unique mediation processes might be required for different places. And South Sudan has certainly struck me as different from many other conflicts on the African continent, particularly its multi-layered nature, where you have the big warring parties, and then splinter groups from the parties, and then more factions from those splinter groups. Then you have communal conflicts, you have clan conflicts, all the way to the family level, as a society has lived in war for the better part of the last 50, 60 years, conditioning a lot of young people to violence as a way of life, as a way of resolving problems, even as a way of addressing domestic issues, domestic family issues, such that violence has become a particular way, call it a subculture or what have you, but the reality is that there is a very violent situation in the country, that any kind of political mediation at the top, any kind of peace agreements reached between the political elite does not and cannot really have a good conception about how to address those things at that level, so that you might end up with a peace agreement, but no peace in actual lives, no peace and stability in the real lives of people, because political settlements at the top don't have an idea about how to address those things. So what would a peace agreement be worth to South Sudan if it does not actually translate into actual peace in their everyday lives? And so that is why I was saying perhaps we have to keep thinking about what types of mediation would be uniquely suitable for South Sudan that we are not able to learn anywhere else. How can regional leaders who are mediating the situation in South Sudan be prevented from looking at South Sudan purely from the point of view of their own geopolitical interests, if they are the ones actually in charge of it? So if they are the ones steering it, how is it going to be possible to prevent them from only looking at that conflict from the point of view of how it affects them, and not necessarily from the perspective of what the South Sudanese need the peace agreement to look like, or the peace process to look like? So even when we talk about pressures that are brought to bear on the parties in South Sudan, what are these pressures? How do they really hurt the position of the parties to the conflict, to the point where they get so hurt as to prioritize peace in order to avoid the hurt? What are these pressures? I mean, these pressures assume that the political leaders in South Sudan who are fighting are actually concerned about the lives of their people, to the point that if some pressure, say reduction or withdrawal of aid, would hurt them, and the political leader will say, oh, if the reduction of aid has hurt my people so badly, then I better talk peace, so to rescue my people. But I have never heard any conversation of that nature ever happening among South Sudanese leaders. How foreign pressures, including withdrawal of aid or reduction of aid, humanitarian or development, is going to force the leaders to actually talk peace. I have personally become skeptical about the place or value of global engagement in South Sudan. It has given the South Sudanese the sense that there is always going to be a bailout coming from somewhere. We get into a crisis, followed by a bailout, another crisis, followed by a bailout. This has been the way we have done things since 1983. I don't remember the last time South Sudanese have been so pushed against the wall that they had to step back and say, hey, the world is getting tired of us. Why can't we think for ourselves? And it might be the time for the world to humble itself and say, nobody really is going to do anything to resolve the conflict in South Sudan but South Sudanese themselves. And that the only thing we can do is take a step back and stare the South Sudanese leaders in the face and see what they will do now that their country is spiraling downwards, and it is going to go away if they continue with the same path. I'm not talking about isolation or sanctions or embargoes or what have you. I'm simply talking about people taking a step back and say, it's your problem, it's your people, it's your country, work it out. And I know the sort of diplomatic and humanitarian challenges against that view. So to the diplomats, it might come as a naive perspective. But I live in South Sudan. My family lives in South Sudan. there has never been a time when South Sudanese themselves have really directly engaged with their leaders and say, here is what you have done to our lives. And that will never come until some of these leaders feel that really there's nobody coming to bail them out. And with another point that I'm going to make to sort of contradict that point I just made, but there is a reason why I'm making it, is whether pushing for what I have observed over the years, over the last 2 or 3 years, is that more and more countries, especially from the global north, being frustrated, having not been able to make a headway, seem to rush to this idea that it's an African problem, that African regional leaders should take a lead on it. I wonder to what extent this has become an alibi for this growing fatigue, simply pushing it. It's an African problem, so maybe they should take a lead on it, because there are some African leaders in the region who are jumping to that opportunity and take the lead, a lead which they know will not produce much because they are constrained by their own political interests and economic and security interests. So, for example, Sudan, one of the lead IGAD member states, involved in the mediation directly, because as Zach has described, there were two main mediators from Sudan, from Ethiopia and Kenya, Ambassador Fium Espen from Ethiopia and Lazarus Ambeo from Kenya, competing for a kind of, not just at their level as individuals, but at the level of Kenya and Uganda, Kenya and Ethiopia, competing for regional leadership. But Sudan then was invited to bring a mediator to have 3. And the result is that Sudan has really been unable to make up its mind about whether a peaceful South Sudan or a South Sudan at war is better for herself. Which one serves its interests better? Is it a South Sudan at war or a South Sudan at peace? And that decision has not been made, and it is evident in the way Sudan has behaved with regards to closure of the borders, pursuit of rebel armies from their borders within South Sudan. With regards to Museveni in Uganda, it was always the case that Museveni is partisan to the war, and how it can sit in the same council of states, of heads of state, as a mediation, and people pretended that this was nothing. The same thing for Salva Kiir himself, the president of South Sudan, who is a party to the conflict but sits in the council of heads of state as an equal. But Riek Machar doesn't. And yet we have the pretense that the process is neutral. Kenya and Ethiopia, as I said, competing for regional dominance and leadership, has already made it clear that outsiders, not only are they not prepared to bring the conflict to an end, they cannot. And there should not be any continued pretense that they will. And perhaps it is time for the world to say, okay, South Sudanese, we have tried. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. I'm sure we will have a robust discussion about some of these propositions and the questions and answers. Francois, I turn to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for allowing me to join the panel. I'm not going to speak very long. I'm just going to make a few points, but I will hope you allow me to be very candid and honest about my struggles with the mediation and South Sudan peace process. But at the same time, I must confess, I need to start by acknowledging that I really thought hard whether I should be here talking to you today. because it's a very risky exercise, what we are trying to do here. It's very easy to hear, we are in New York, in the seat of the UN Security Council, etc., almighty and powerful, and we are looking at IGAD, which is not the strongest of the sub-regional organizations on the continent, and trying to judge, what went wrong, did they do a good job or not? And it's a posture which can appear very patronizing. And here I am, another Muzungu from the UN Secretariat, looking at the performance of our partners and colleagues in the region. So it's a very risky exercise, and from the start, I need to say that I will try to approach it with a necessary humility, from which we, I, as a United Nations staff member, having tried to support the peace process for a number of years, need to speak of for a number of reasons. Number one, it's not like, the United Nations is successful everywhere where we support peace processes. The list of, we shouldn't do UN bashing, but the list of failures is long. So mediation is a struggle. It's a struggle for everybody. It's a struggle for IGAD, for the EU, for the UN, and in other regions of the world. And when we have, great successes, we should not forget that we hardly have only successes, and therefore it's not, it's a real difficult situation that this mediation was trying to deal with. I think number two is we need also to address it by looking at whether us, the United Nations Secretariat in this respect, or the US government in that respect, did we do what we should have done? Did we do enough? Did we help in a way which actually was impactful? And it's a difficult, autocritique that we need to conduct, but which is necessary. By looking at the South Sudan peace process, it's not just about pointing the finger at our regional partners. It's also looking at ourselves and looking also, and member states need to look at themselves, and members of the UN Security Council in particular, because we have a collective responsibility when it comes to peace and security. And in this case, I can unfortunately confirm Joke's, feeling that many member states were very happy that this is taken care of, by IGAD in the lead, because then they don't have to deal with it. Or, the African solutions for African problems mantra is convenient, even though it's an issue of international peace and security. You have 2 million IDPs, 2 million refugees, mass atrocities beyond anybody's, understanding, but still it's quite convenient that you are not held responsible for the challenges and the failures of the process. So, this is what needs to empower our humility to look at these issues. But nevertheless, I think it's important that we look at them, because indeed people are dying, and we need to seize every opportunity and make every effort to try and impact the situation on the ground. So let me first, the paper and the approach was indeed to try to look at, by the textbook, whether the issues of, preparedness, consent, impartiality, inclusivity, strategy were addressed properly. I don't think any peace process, any mediation process actually follows the textbook. And if you look at currently what's happening in Ukraine, the Middle East, Syria, etc., any of those issues are actually addressed ideally. So we need to probably dig deeper into the specificities, I think, of the South Sudan peace process. Now, how can we dig deeper? I think one of the complexities, and maybe, I'm happy to be criticized by Joke on this, because it probably be influenced by too many years of working on the Congo, on Eastern Congo. But we need to look at how the different arenas of conflict actually are, interconnected and connect to one another. And here we have indeed a regional arena where there's a lot of stake. Indeed, Uganda was a party to the conflict, a member of IGAD, and the neighboring countries have a stake, just like they had in other countries. They have national interest, economic interest, political interests. So there is this balance between the investment into, I would say, the public good, the peace process, and then the satisfaction of national interests. In addition to that, we have, I would say, another layer in terms of the regional investment in the South Sudan peace process, which is the fact that it's about the survival of the SPLM, a national liberation movement, and we have other national liberation movements who have invested into safeguarding the future and of national liberation movements, and in the region. So you had of course the regional arena, which is not just about the interests of the neighbors, but it's also about the ANC, the Chama Chama Pinduzi, the NRM, etc., the EPRDF and TPLF, and some of them were actually fighting one another to try to invest into the reunification of the SPLM. Then, of course, you have the national level, the arena of conflict between the big leaders, and it's very, very often be portrayed as the two big men, the Salva Kiir and Riek Machar. But of course, much more complicated, because it's about the future. It's about the succession of the current elites and who will be in charge and who will be able to benefit from the oil resources. Let's not forget the political economy of the country and how it is distorted by the fact that 95 or even more percent of the national revenue comes from one resource. And of course, you have another arena which is local, which is at now 32 state level, and which is also about land, about cattle, about access to water, grazing, etc., and which affects the survival of many. Just to give you, we did recently an analysis of the fatalities in the country. In the past 4 months, there are more fatalities from intercommunal violence than from the conflict itself. Now, this is, of course, recent. It's because there's been a decrease in the intensity of the fighting between the main actors, I would say, of the peace process. But it's significant that this is an angle, if we want, a peace process to be relevant, it's an angle that needs to be addressed. And the connections between the different levels are not just in a nice, I would say, vertical way. You have a local, then a national, then the regional. No, because you may have regional actors who are interacting at local level. In particular, of course, Sudan. I mean, they are engaging at local level because they're also satisfying their own constituencies at local level along the long border that they have with South Sudan, the 2,000-kilometer long border. So it is quite a complex scene, quite, a difficult scene that, for mediation to address, for mediation to digest, for a political strategy to be able to connect the different dots. I didn't touch about the international area because, the global battle between the big powers is not playing out so much in South Sudan, even though we can see today additional connections and with the Middle East or with the Gulf rivalries, with the entry of new actors. But nevertheless, you can start to grasp the complexity for mediation, particularly as it tries to be relevant. And I think that's one of the issues that we need to try and work on more, which is the fact that we have a political process which is struggling to be relevant, and relevant in two respects. Number one, for the victims of the conflict. What is worth a political process if the number of victims of the conflicts, are just increasing year after year after year after year? I mean, UNHCR is evaluating that there will be another 600,000 refugees in the coming year. We are 2.1, now it's going to be 2.7 million. Probably give it a few months, it will be 3 million. So that's the first challenge. And here did we do enough to connect the different dimensions, to use the instruments that the mediation could have, used? And here, I think one of the issues that we struggled and we need to continue looking at is how the CTSAM and the instruments which are actually deployed in the country on the ground and can connect with the actors of the conflict actually relate, their interests are connected to the bigger political negotiations. To have not just because it helps with leverage, but also it helps with relevance. It's not just about sharing posts. It's also about addressing, what is relevant for the actors of the violence and for the victims of the conflict. It's, of course, mediation 101. It is, you have actors of the conflict, they have interests, you are trying to change their positions, you are trying to convince them that they can achieve their, interests without just killing the enemy or the population supporting the enemy. But making these connections is difficult. And the last point I wanted to make, of course, is the struggle is with the leverage. And let's stop thinking about leverage in terms of, the textbook, the toolbox. Let's start thinking about leverage, which makes a difference for the South Sudanese actors of the violence. If you look at so-and-so, 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 what is actually of value to them? Is it because they have a bank account or, in Nairobi, or a house or 2 or 3 houses actually in Nairobi or Kampala? Or is it the 300,000 heads of cattle that they have in this area of the country? And I think unless we succeed to adapt our instruments to have leverage on the actors of the violence, we will continue to struggle, with a mediation or with a peace process which will miss the point, because it follows textbooks or because it follows templates which, we have been developed internationally, regionally, and which is the way of running business that international organizations run business, but may not be necessarily relevant and efficient and effective in addressing the specific South Sudanese situations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know that I have a whole series of questions that I want to ask our panelists, but I will restrain myself. Let's open to the floor. I'll take sort of 3 questions or so at a time. I've already got 3 collected. So please, if I could ask you to say your name, your affiliation, and please do make an effort to keep your comments, question as brief as possible. I'll start here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Helen Norris. I work for UNDP, and I've been involved in South Sudan for the past 4 years. I was quite struck by Mr. Jock's... Closer, can you hear me? I was quite struck by, and it resonated with me, what Dr. Jock was saying about the outsider's approach, and that this is, for South Sudanese to, figure out for themselves. I'm paraphrasing. I wondered if any of you have any kind of opinions about the local efforts. I know the country team is specifically looking at possibilities of working in what they call pockets of peace and to try and empower local communities to install local security components and the various different resilience mechanisms to withstand conflict. And I would be very, very appreciative if people could give me some insights or thoughts about local initiatives, and because it all seems very high level, and the danger is that we're empowering warlords and empowering people at a very high level, negotiating level, very far away from the people on the ground. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, Susan Page. I know everybody on the panel, so it's really great to see you guys. Thank you very much. This is a question that obviously Zach and I have a slight difference of opinion, but because we have the Deputy Ambassador from Finland who was supporting, through CMI, supporting the other, what you call competing peace process. I was the first U.S. ambassador in South Sudan, so I was there when the war broke out in 2013, the evacuation, et cetera, et cetera. And then I was ambassador to the AU in Addis during the peace talks. So I'm curious, though, why, because the view from the field was that the SPLM discussions were, in fact, quite a bit richer than the mediation. And granted, it was on a different subject, which leads me to ask the real question, which is, why do so many people think that it was such a contradictory or a searching for a venue, because they were along very different lines. And I thought that if some of the results that came out, regardless of whether the SPLM reunited, which to me is a different issue, but they apologized, they had frank discussions, and I thought that if they could have taken some of the outcomes of those talks and put them into the actual mediation process, it could have been a good idea. So just kind of curious about the other panelists' views on the SPLM reunification talks. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Houston Lako, Center for Peace and Development, University of Juba, South Sudan. It's my colleague there, and Ambassador Page. It's good to see you. I think we are just going to make a quick comment. I think the issue here, we have missed the chance in 2010. We have not discussed the issue of governance, transition leadership within the SPLM. The focus was from the international community, it is let us get the big enemy out of the game, which is the North. And yet we have forgot that the big elephant is inside the room. That was the bigger mistake. And I have raised this issue in 2010 with Grecians, Ambassador Preston Lehman in Washington. People say, no, let us just focus on the North first, and then we will deal with the rest later. But that was the first mistake. And the other thing, the issue of the leadership. You and everybody here in the room would agree with me that African leadership put their interests, their personal interests first, the interests of the nation last. And therefore, we don't expect anything would happen from the African leadership unless we have to import Magufuli from Tanzania to rule South Sudan for another 2 years. Maybe we'll see some changes. Now, the shortcut to this situation in South Sudan, we have to convince both parties into the conflict. Now there are more than three. For them to stay aside, put a new transitional government for 3 years, to run the government by the independent technocrats. And therefore, if anyone would like to contest, let them come later on after the 3 years to contest. The second thing from the international community to do, create the court, the hybrid court, African hybrid court, so that anybody who is found guilty should not contest. So simple as that. Otherwise, we're just maintaining the same people for the last 10 years, and more people are going to die. With regard to the mediation, this is my final point. The mediation in South Sudan to solve national dialogue is a myth, because 56% of the members are from the tribe of the president. The total number is 94. How do you expect it's going to be an equality? You have Francis Deng and his brother is a member. You have Lele, Deputy Minister of Information, and her father is a member, and so forth and so forth. Unless the people who are suffering the displaced and the IDP, they were not in the table. How could that be? How could we call it a national dialogue? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to draw out a couple of other points, then questions of my own, totally misusing the moderator's prerogative. One is, the issue that was raised here around processes that are elite-only driven and don't have sort of resonance and ownership from communities gets to the point that Helen was making. I'd be really interested in following up on that. Another question, I think, drawing in part on some of the points that you were raising, sir, is this issue of, Francois, you raised the point about the international community being held responsible. I'm also very interested in hearing from the panelists about how ongoing concerns around impunity, including prior to December 2013, actually were a key factor in stymieing efforts to promote peace and reconciliation. And then, of course, I mentioned a panel that we, as IPI, co-hosted last week with African women mediators, and one of the key points from someone who's involved in this particular case pointed to the fact that key political actors in the negotiations in South Sudan actually explicitly referring to women and their rights as a minority issue, despite the very gendered nature of the way that the conflict is actually being fought. And we've discussed a little bit here around challenges on inclusivity, but how do we reconcile the effort to get people to the table with the very real fact that more than 50%, even 60% of the population is being effectively kept out of talks. So I will stop my abuse of the moderator's privilege now and turn to Zach for some reflections, and then to our other two colleagues.
First, on the point about elite processes, I think we all up here would very much agree with that. And it was a fundamental discussion in Addis Ababa. The mediators, to reiterate Francois' point, were in an impossible situation, an impossible task. There were lots of South Sudanese clamoring to be involved in the process, and the two parties that were waging the war on the ground were actively maneuvering to keep them out of the process. There were attempts very early in the process to try and open it, and when I say participation or inclusivity, it doesn't necessarily mean just a seat at the table, right? There are lots of ways that folks can be involved. So the mediators did receive a series of recommendations and ideas from a number of corners in their own countries, among the South Sudanese and among the peace process supporters, some of which included creating a radio station at the peace process such that plenaries could be broadcast back to South Sudan, where that's the most widespread form of communication, that the mediators themselves would have an opportunity to speak directly to the people. Second, to create formal feedback loops where you'd create groups in country. Again, this idea came from South Sudanese. The challenge was how to get this inserted into the process when the folks at the table don't want it. So formal feedback loops such that decisions on a daily or weekly basis could be fed back to groups in South Sudan, and there'd be official feedback loops. And one step even further, I think, and actually General Sambewo did this before an earlier peace process, was an encouragement to go to South Sudan and to fly around and to meet with local communities and different groups, so you weren't just getting input from the folks with guns. Ultimately, and again, they were in an impossible situation, but the mediators opted against these ideas. And I think there's a number of potential explanations why. One was obviously a very fragile process that they were attempting to sort of give it an early foundation. So there was opposition from the parties. I don't know that they were getting a lot of support up the chain from their own bosses about pursuing these kinds of ideas. But there's a broader sense, particularly in the beginning, and I think it waned over time, and this is also to Francois' point, that the governments in the region looked at South Sudan and I think in some ways mistakenly saw themselves. They believed the SPLM to be a viable one-party or a viable party that could sort of govern in a one-party way, much like many of their own governments. And the reality was that the SPLM was, in my view, a hollowed-out shell, a liberation movement that hadn't redefined itself in the post-liberation era. And that leads me to the second follow-up on the Arusha process. And we can come back, sorry, and I know your question was also not just about the peace process, but about how do you support local peace efforts while it's ongoing. And I think the obvious question that it's not one or the other is a false choice between a high-level deal and peace initiatives on the ground. Ultimately, they're both necessary. In order for local peace initiatives to succeed, there's got to be, the level of violence has to be under control. On Arusha and the alternative process via the SPLM, I think I detailed a little bit more in the paper, but my own opinion is formed in part by the hostility to Arusha that was deep and wide, not particularly from outsiders, but from the opposition. I think what a lot of folks didn't pay attention to in Addis was that the majority of the quote-unquote rebel movement was utterly, utterly opposed to the SPLM and to the Arusha process, and that goes back to the earlier war. They tried very actively to prevent their de facto leader, Riek Machar, from ever engaging in the process and tried to get him not to go. Also from civil society groups, from parties, the refrain was, these are the 30 guys that broke this place. Why are we going to hand the mantle back to them, sort of put the band back together and let them set it up? I mean, there was nothing, in my opinion, more dangerous than that. And unfortunately, that's a shade of that is where the EGAD process ended up when it narrowed. But I think that was the rationale behind it, and I think some questions about the motivations of each party for going to Arusha in the first place. I think it was quite clear to folks paying attention that the government had requested the alternative mediation format when the EGAD process attempted to expand. when there were efforts to try and bring other stakeholders to the table, when the government saw that nobody was buying the narrative of a coup d'etat, suddenly they didn't like the IGAD format very much and they were scrambling for an alternative. So that, for the record, came at the request of the government. Secondly, as I mentioned, the opposition, Riek Machar and a handful of people were the only folks that were really interested in SPLM reconciliation, again, mostly as a path back to power because of the SPLM's grip on the state. And thirdly, the former detainees, all elite sort of party members, but many who didn't have constituencies on the ground, when they found themselves edged out of the IGAD process, they too were looking for an alternative format. So I think there were real questions about the motivations for any of the parties there and were any of them genuine.
Thank you. So just a remark on the elite versus the rest thing. I guess the temptation is great for any mediator to say, who are the ones holding the guns? Those are the ones, the people I have to focus on, because like it or not, they are the ones who are threatening the lives of people. So there is no question that you want to engage with them, but at the same time, while you're engaging with them, the truth is that even as war goes on, life has to happen, right? People have to live, people have to go to school, people have to have work, people have to farm and all this. It's a reality of life. War doesn't stop life from going on. So in recognizing that, it would be important to your question about some of the initiatives that are going on locally. Obviously, they need some kind of blessing from the top. Otherwise, somebody is going to think that the local peace initiative that is going on in Western Equatoria is going to undermine my ability to negotiate at the top. So they will stop it. So you want to get their buy-in first. But then there are established mechanisms that are going on. There are three main areas in South Sudan where work can still be done to meet with the local level, with the national level peace processes. The Jonglei triangle between the Murle and the Nuer and the Dinka is one area. The tri-state border between Lake Unity and Warap is another area. Western Equatoria and Bahar Ghazal, where cattle keepers are going into farm areas, is another area where regional conferences can be held to try to get people not just to continue to work and live, but to talk with one another about how they can share these resources. These do not need a peace agreement to be signed. So that is to your point. SPLM, yes, I think Zach is quite right in thinking of SPLM as a sort of a emotional entity that is fighting its own shadows. But it's emotional from the point of view of the other old liberation parties in Africa. So they think of it as, it's important for liberation parties to remain in power because they did the liberation. It was the position of ANC. Cyril Ramaphosa came to Juba and met with all of us and made that point very clear that we are not going to allow anybody to mess with the SPLM. But does the SPLM exist in real sense as a political party that is organized with organs ready to table its plan for development, for peace, for all of that? It doesn't exist. SPLM is dead. As far as an institution is concerned, SPLM doesn't exist anymore, in my view. I think it only exists in our minds, and from emotional point of view, as the party that led us to having a country. But it has already lost its power. South Sudanese are quick to say, why not put a technocratic government in place? But who does that? Who puts them there?
Yeah.
I mean, the world community cannot go there and say, okay, you step down, we're putting somebody. Of course, it cannot happen. He's the president. We cannot wish him away. Whether we like it or not, he's the man running the country. So if South Sudanese want him out, South Sudanese has to speak of it. They have to do it themselves. And the violence has been attempted. It is not working. So maybe there's another way to do it. Civic engagement, civic activity. South Sudanese are so divided that they are afraid of each other. That if they are going to ever have a say in who rules them, then rebuilding those ethnic relations across the board is going to be the only way they can actually speak about removing a president and installing a government, a transitional government, up to the time when you will have elections. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, I would like to push back on the idea that we don't have African leaders who are actually, working for the greater good of the country and only see their own interests first. Look, you just have the resignation of the Permanent Minister of Ethiopia because he felt that he needed to hand over to have a new leadership. So we have indeed, and if we look at, I'm a European, so I'll speak about Europe. If you look at Brexit or Catalonia, here you have selfish leaders who actually put the future of their countries, on dangerous paths. So, it's always a mix. And what we are dealing with, of course, is but we need to address how these leaders see themselves. What is their source of legitimacy? And whether or not indeed you have, institutions which are actually in which they believe in and which processes help manage the situation. And here, I think it's been said by other colleagues, the SPLM is a particularly weak institution which could not manage the succession issue because it's not the ANC, it's not even ZANU-PF, it's not the RPF, it's not the NRM, it's not the PRDF. It's an illusion of liberation liberation movement, and to a certain extent, this is part of there's a lot of investment into reviving what never was. And another point on the issue of the local conflicts. There's a lot of effort right now, and there's been a lot of effort, and it's increasing, to address local conflicts because indeed they are the ones, currently causing most fatalities. The two most brutal ones have been in the area of what used to be Lake State and also Jonglei. They are not necessarily, we talk about intercommunal because they're not necessarily between what is identified as different tribes or different communities. It's not necessarily Dinka Nowhere or in the case of Jonglei, it's Lao Nowhere and Morley. That's one of the most dangerous one. But in the lakes area, it's between different, Dinka sections. And then if you go to what used to be Unity State, the worst atrocities have been committed by newer sections against one another. Now, in this context, the problem is that, I think we have, and UNMISS is working very hard with its partners to do firefighting, because some of them are related to yearly cycles related to the migrations. Others are related to access to grazing and water points. Now, the problem is that firefighting doesn't resolve anything. You adjust by time. And the issue is about the resolution and the sustainability of local conflict resolution mechanisms. Now, and if you deal with the resolution, you're talking about governance. You're talking about how our natural resource is going to be managed. And very quickly, you're talking about, therefore, how the state is organized, how it is managed, how people are appointed, and for what reasons, and you address the requirement to change the governance system of the country through the talk. So the sustainability of local conflict resolution very quickly gets articulated to the bigger picture, to the political process. And unless both actually working, are relevant for one another, you end up neither of them, being, sustainable. And it's one of the big challenges for the mediations, because it's already so hard when you are trying to manage, the big boys, the big men's, interests. In addition, you need to consider the relevance of the local arena. It's extremely difficult. And what's also very, sensitive is that more people are killed locally because you touch on the feeling of communities, their means of livelihood. If they don't have access to this water point, if they don't have the grazing area, they feel that their livelihood, their identity could be challenged and they are ready to kill for that, and they are ready to kill, to try and make sure that the other, is actually totally, wiped out. And you're looking at, so therefore, massive violence. So it's not these are very, very difficult issues to address and to for these also agreements to be sustainable. And right now, the mission is definitely trying to double up or triple up its efforts on addressing local conflicts, but the issue of resilience of communities and the follow-up in terms of investment, of projects to make sure that the implementation of local agreements is palatable and sustainable is really a problem. I was in Rumbek 10 days ago. Agencies, funds of programs have gone from Rumbek. There is no partner anymore to address the follow-through in terms of what could be development projects, etc., etc. Because all the money goes into humanitarian assistance, and because the humanitarian, bill has gone, I think it's $1.2 billion now, it's totally unsustainable. You have needs which are just going through the roof, and you have funding, streams which cannot. I mean, they are not going to increase anymore. In fact, they are going to reduce, and the gap is going to be catastrophic. So in terms of the impact on populations, it's bad, of course, in terms of the actual humanitarian assistance, but also in terms of conflict resolution, it's also difficult because there is just no resources available to change the dynamic on the ground.
Okay, we've got time for one or two more questions. I've got one in the back. Any more? You're going to ask another one? Okay. There's a... Oh.
Thanks. Sorry.
Yes, sorry, just remember, name, affiliation, and brief.
Okay,
Thanks.
great. Matthew Lee, Inner City Press. I was listening to it across the street, and this might seem too small a question, but I'm wondering, this is particularly for the UN peacekeeping member of the panelist, in covering South Sudan, there are these periodic malfeasance. There was the sexual abuse in Wau by the UN police from Ghana. There's a more recent case involving Nepali peacekeepers. And I'm just wondering, what's the interrelation between the UN's role in this mediation process and these things that have happened, and that does it undermine the credibility of the UN as it presents itself as a mediator? I would ask, Susan Page, I noticed that you're here as well, to the degree in Haiti, like has the bringing in of cholera, does it impact the UN's ability to present itself as a development partner or as a mediator? Thanks a lot.
I'll ask mine briefly as well. You mentioned, Dr. Taylor, about impunity and whatnot, and I don't think anybody really touched on it. I would love I think it's great about possibly having the court established, but there's so much that needs to happen that I would hope that nobody's waiting for some court to magically appear. So just your thoughts. I think we all know how bad it is, but if there are efforts ongoing to address it.
Great, thank you. So did you have a, John? That covered. Yeah, I was going to say, so I think we basically have an impunity question, 2 impunity questions. And so if I could just ask the panelists to maybe speak to those points, and then okay. Very, very quickly, because we need to have time for them to give their final comments as well.
Thank you.
One final question.
Yes, considering that the humanitarian, Dr. Danieli of the International Organization for Victim Assistance, considering the humanitarian activities, do they at all try to address the issue of mediation within the communities? Because what you were telling us was that people don't know anything but violence, that even on the level of the home. Is that being addressed at all on the ground?
Thank you very much. So I'll pass to our panelists for reflections on these questions and also any final points that they want to make.
You want to go first, Jack? Well, am I on?
So polite. We'll go in the same order. No? Yeah.
Impunity. With 9 minutes left. I mean, I'd welcome the thoughts of the others. This obviously ran in parallel to much of the peace process, and you had quite a historic event when the African Union established its first ever commission of inquiry into the violence, which I thought was a great development. There were a lot of competing opinions as to why that was initiated, and thus we saw later that rather than release the report during the process, many of the IGAD heads of state requested that it not. Again, we can guess the motivations. Some feared it may disrupt the peace process. Some feared it may make things worse. There were lots of folks both in the region and in South Sudan and more broadly that hoped to see it released sooner. And on the flip side of that, I think it's worth mentioning that there was also in the early stages a very real concern in some quarters that this not become the next contentious chapter in the Africa versus the West debate on justice. And that was all mixed up in the process at the time. So I think it's given the fate of the peace agreement as it stands now, including the justice angle and the request for a hybrid court, that seems a far cry from reality at the moment, but it's obviously, I think, something that a lot of South Sudanese would continue to like to see. Do you want me to make the rest of my...
Do you want to, if you have any final points, because this
Sure.
is going to be your chance.
Okay.
Okay.
I think just to reiterate on the process itself, and I appreciate a lot of questions and thoughts so far. Obviously, the parties themselves are most responsible both for the conflict and for making peace in their country. I think this paper and this exercise is, this is the entry point for the rest of us. This is the entry point, and thus it merits critical review. And in that way, that's a collective responsibility. It's not just IGAD. It's a larger body of African states, and it's a larger body of peace process supporters, including the United States, including the UN and others. So I think in that's the frame of the paper, and I think that's where we see the fundamental issues that are identified and offer some first-order lessons, hopefully, for when we're confronted with these points again. And I think there's a second level of conversation here about the specific lessons learned, and is there a way, for example, just as one, to think about a different mediation formula, as opposed to African solutions for African problems or an entirely outside process. Is there a formula that couples regional players and their comparative advantage with other mediation expertise, with a more formal a role for third ring sort of international actors? In theory, such a structure could facilitate both the use of incentives and pressures better, could draw on the comparative advantages I mentioned, while preventing the sort of negative effects that happened between regional states. Now, doesn't that sound terribly wise? Such coordination, as we know, is always more challenging in practice. As I mentioned at the outset, singular conclusions are hard to draw. I think those close to the process are sometimes limited in thinking creatively about alternatives, especially in real time. And I think those further away on the sidelines who dismiss the process, I think sometimes can fail to appreciate both its merits, what it did achieve or could have achieved, and the political obstacles to fashioning a viable alternative. And I think the current struggles that we see in the high-level revitalization forward provide some evidence to underscore this point. So again, I think the goal of the exercise, and I thank IPI for this, is perhaps or the best we can do is to evaluate these lessons and build upon them. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
On impunity, it has to be said that one of the key drivers of violence in South Sudan is injustice. It's the sense that this community was aggressed last year, but they never got any kind of recompense for it, whether it is their property or people killed. Nothing, right? So what do they have for recourse? Next year, if they get an opportunity, they will revenge to settle the scores. So there's no question that in order to get peace in South Sudan, some form of justice has to be ensured. But does it work? Does sort of mass justice? Does it work in a situation where the solution came through a negotiated settlement? Does it work anywhere in the world? Has it worked where you have negotiated a peace agreement and then got the warring parties to sign their necks onto the guillotines? Right? It doesn't. So none of these warring parties are ever going to say, yes, we want peace, and yes, we want to be tried. So what is going to happen? How is justice ever going to come in order for the cycle of injustice, war to stop? I think there are examples that we can go by on the African continent where people have agreed that what we need right now is to end the killings, end the death, end the violence. And the only way for that to happen is for all those who have been involved in violence to get a kind of amnesty, such that when you have set up institutions of the state, the justice system is established and supported and has grown, that justice system can now be a place where families, individuals, communities can go to seek justice against people who are now part of the government. But that justice will have to come after we have ended the war. I mean, I don't know any other place where, I mean, the Liberians have done it, the Sierra Leoneans have done it, the South Africans are doing it. Unless you have a situation like Rwanda where one party won, and then that party lived long to write the books, you are not going to have justice be put ahead of peace. Otherwise, you will continue for people to want to escape being tried by being obtuse to the last minute about peace. So that's about injustice. But I think there is already something going on among South Sudanese themselves, which is that people are tired of death and are tired of war. And that if this death should stop today, we will talk about justice in a different way. Justice through institutional reforms. Justice through government being effective such that there is no ubiquitous absence of the state from people's lives, because that is what facilitates justice, injustice. It is the absence of government at so many levels of the society. There is no judge in a county. There is no police efficient in a Payam. So who is going to enforce justice if the state is not there? So if there is a way for South Sudanese to begin building their institutions, then justice will become something that you get through these reforms, and not something that you have to get at all costs, even if that cost is a continuation of war.
Thank you very much. Maybe to complement this issue on accountability, it's obviously one of the most difficult angle of any peace process. I just want to make one additional comment, which is that, as you know, the new mandate of UNMISS has given the mission, I would say, additional authorization or emphasis on the issue of working with national rule of law institutions to strengthen their ability to address some crimes, and in particular sexual violence. And having just returned from Juba and engaged with our partners and counterparts, you have men and women of integrity who want justice for their country in South Sudan. You have judges, you have police officers, you have prosecutors, you have lawyers. We need, and they want the assistance, of the UN and other partners to restore basic minimum, capacity in the country to deliver the little. Of course, it's going to be in view of the extent of the atrocities committed. It's going to look like very little, but you have to start somewhere. You have to set the ball rolling. You have to fight for the end of impunity. And I think we are, with the mandate, with the leadership of the mission and the leadership of the organization here, we'll do everything we can to invest, indeed, to restore this slowly but surely, together with other partners, this basic capability to push forward the fight against impunity. So, And we need to do that, investing into our national colleagues, as I said, judges, lawyers, police officers, corrections officers, who want impunity to end in their country and are ready to take risks for that. They do take risks. I mean, it's a risky business fighting for justice in your own country in the current South Sudanese environment. So we need to support them, and we'll try to do so the best we can. On the question is whether SEA is impacting the credibility of the mission. Of course, when you have sexual exploitation by UN staff members, they do impact the credibility of the institution and its ability to, and the faith in its intentions. Recently, we were with, SG Keita visited Western Bahr el Ghazal. She met with civil society and NGOs, and they raised these issues. And they are legitimate issues that they need to raise. And as UN officials and both headquarters and the senior leadership of the mission, I think we are working, and we are going to do everything we can to make sure that allegations are addressed and accountability is found to make sure that there is trust between the United Nations and the people of South Sudan. Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank all of you for being here for this conversation. I would like to thank Finland again for their contribution and support. I'd particularly like to thank the panelists for what I certainly found to be a really insightful conversation about everything from impunity to how we can better improve our understanding of mediation, to local peace efforts, to preventing peace processes from remaining at the elite level. All of these wrapped up in a really interesting couple of hours here. So thank you again. Thanks.